Welcome to the Greener Way podcast, a show about people, planet, and purpose, and how investors and corporate leaders push forward in a complex world. Welcome to the Greener Way podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Alambakis. In this episode, brought to you by First Sentier Investors, we'll be talking about engagements. Active owners and investors usually cite deep conversations with portfolio companies as a key weapon in the stewardship arsenal. But how do we know if they're successful? Joining us to discuss this point and more is Sudip Hazra, a director at First Sentier MUFG Sustainable Investment Institute. The Institute literally researched this very question. So Sudip, let's get into it. First of all, can you give us a little bit of background? What is the First Sentier MUFG Sustainable Investment Institute?
So thank you, Rachel, for having me with you. I've been in the sustainability space now for about 15 years, and I've seen a good chunk of the ecosystem for investors. So I was attracted to this role because the Institute is quite an exciting and unique concept. It was set up a couple of years ago, and it came out of a joint venture between MUFG and First Sentier Investors. So the idea is to have a dedicated sustainability research capability, and we provide thematic research and insights across a number of different environmental, social, and corporate governance themes. One of the ways in which we're supported very well is that we have a dedicated academic advisory board with academics across the world, really. So there we have quite a robust process and input into our different papers. And also, in terms of the reach of the Institute, we want it to be as broad as possible. So certainly we interact a lot with our clients and asset owners, but we want it to be available to the entire ecosystem of investors. So that includes, for example, investment advisors, consultants, but also regulators, nonprofits, and the media. And the idea there is that we really want to have an educational purpose as well, more broadly, to promote sustainability and help with some of the understanding on the themes, that are well established, but also some of the themes that are less well known also.
Excellent. So now that we know that you've got the chops, both from the experience and from the advisory board that you have on this institute, Sudip, can you tell us a little bit more about this particular piece of research and how do you define what a successful engagement is?
So the background to this paper was that we felt obviously engagement is one of the central outcomes and really vehicles that investors use to identify a number of different things, including financial materiality, but also in terms of establishing a relationship with a company and, in ESG terms, actually establishing impact on an ongoing basis. But one thing we did find is that often the views that were coming out in existing research, particularly academic research, were more centered on investors themselves rather than the corporates. So the objective of this paper was to really look at that slightly underviewed area of, what the corporates think will make engagements better and what will facilitate, a better, free-flowing, longer conversation. So we partnered with PwC here, and the starting point was to look at a lot of the existing research and identify some of the trends and potentially some of the gaps. And after that, we came up with a survey of questions to ask investors to really understand better what would be their preferences in order to come up with successful outcomes for engagements as a whole. And in terms of the cohort, we took about 100 companies globally of different sizes, and that also included 10 C-suite interviews to get a little bit more detailed understanding on some of the questions.
What are some of the key considerations here, Sudip, in terms of how do you define a successful engagement, and what are the key inputs to having a successful series of ongoing conversations between an investor and a portfolio company?
So one thing we did acknowledge in this report is that there's no universally accepted definition of a successful engagement. But what we did is, for us, we defined a successful engagement as being one which results in a meaningful change in corporate behavior, strategy, or policy. So that's really the key. It's still a pretty open definition because engagements, as I said, can be so many things for so many different people. And even within one firm, you may have slightly different focuses. So that was really, one of the outcomes.
I often joke with here at FS Sustainability, our unofficial motto is FS Sustainability, it depends, because it's, as you say, it's so dependent on the investor and it's so dependent on the company.
Sure, yes.
So to what extent then does a successful engagement depend on the knowledge and the diligence of the investor versus the approachability and willingness of the investee company? How do you sort of define those halves of the equation?
Yeah, sure. So there could be some cases where engagement doesn't actually result in the change that was established and expected, but still shareholders and even the company might view it to be a success. And that could be for a number of reasons, i.e., a better relationship was established, or indeed, it may have been the case that the actual initial outcome that was proposed was found to be maybe not the best outcome over a certain change in time. So really, I guess one of the key things there is helpful sharing of information where both parties are very active and there's a constructive dialogue. And in some cases, we may see that shareholders achieve a kind of outcome for their engagement that they didn't always expect, but they still view that as being positive, irrespective of whether they've actually put that as an initial outcome that was looking to be attained.
So then, as you've done this research, then how do your colleagues at FSI then optimize both halves of this equation to maximize outcomes, essentially return for investors?
So one thing to note is we did show that companies themselves are very open to engagement. And in the dialogues we've had so far with asset owners, many have been surprised that what we found was actually that 96% of companies that we interviewed found that shareholder engagements were a productive use of their time and resources. And the reason that's high, I think, is because companies are open to dialogue, but they want the dialogue to take place, in a constructive way. So typically, some of the factors which we think are very important for that kind of success would be that typically engagements have a objective and some kind of metrics discussed at the outset, and then also that there's a sense of mutual understanding between the investor and the companies, and that there's a sense that trust is being built. And that means also that any kind of confrontational measures are used wisely. That isn't to say that an escalation process isn't there. And what I mean by that is, I think companies themselves will often appreciate some kind of escalation process, which will be clarified to say that if an engagement doesn't reach an outcome, these are the potential actions. Another thing we also found was that having capable and experienced individuals on the investor side leading the engagement also was highly appreciated by companies themselves and certainly made a difference to actionable outcomes. And so on that, it could also include the fact that direct engagement, where the shareholder themselves or other kinds of asset class investors were involved, having that kind of direct contact was very highly appreciated. So that meant also that one of the findings was that the recommendations of proxy advisors, although valuable, companies wanted to see them as really an advice for investors rather than an instruction, i.e. really the starting point of a dialogue rather than an end outcome in itself. And also face-to-face engagement, which were private, were also highly prized rather than having intermediaries or just written letters.
I think that's a really interesting point there, Sudip, and something that we track here at FS Sustainability, that the utility of a letter campaign is fairly limited in terms of that deep ongoing dialogue that you talk about. So it's interesting that the report would highlight that as well.
Yes.
So another thing that I found in the report, Sudip, was that obviously you did track that ESG-related engagements are on the rise. Considering that ESG is becoming more regulated, both from the perspective of, laws around the world as well as the fear of greenwashing, how does this affect ESG-related engagements?
I think investors are clearly having to respond to a lot of new regulation. And one of the outcomes there is that engagement actually becomes quite a useful tool in producing some of the results that are needed for that regulation. So typically, one of the key issues that investors would face is a lack of data. So often an end of engagement will be transparency and producing some of that data itself. But clearly, I mean, there are still some challenges, and both investors and issuers are still grappling with some of those questions around the regulation and the kind of results that are required there.
And so as a result, does this lead to more nuanced conversations? Does it lead to maybe recalibrating either the timeline for the asks or the requests that investors put to companies themselves?
So I think one of the changes here is that the demonstrated value of engagements can sometimes be a little bit more aligned with regulatory outcomes. And I think sometimes shareholders will be looking to make that clearer at the outset of an engagement. However, I think often some of the regulatory outcomes are really part of an existing set of questions that investors have had for a long time. So it's not necessarily something completely new when we do have a regulatory need to engage on some of the thematics.
Interesting. Okay. Sudip, I was so glad that we are going to have this conversation today because I'll be honest with you. The issue of how to define a successful engagement, how investors react or escalate with unsuccessful engagements is something that I think a lot about. And we spend a lot of time writing about at FS Sustainability. What happens if engagements are unsuccessful? You referred that the need for those clear escalation steps as part of the process.
In the report, we identified unsuccessful engagements as having kind of at least one of the following four features. The first was a lack of demonstrated value, i.e., issuers themselves were often not clear what the ideal engagement outcome would be. Second of all, there was a perception that sometimes there was a lack of shareholder knowledge or understanding, i.e., that there wasn't a full appreciation of the relevance of the engagement question to the business model of the company. And that can be quite important because some engagement styles will typically take a blanket set of questions and propose them to a large number of companies. And that's certainly not our approach, and that's not what we want to do. So one of the outcomes of our survey was certainly that shareholder knowledge and understanding of the issuer was needed for a successful engagement. Also, the resource question was very important. And what I mean by that is if a company felt that it didn't have enough resources to dedicate to an engagement, that was an obstacle. So typically, if a company didn't have the time, the expertise internally, or even the financial resources to dedicate, that was a problem. So typically, really making the resource usage from the issuer point of view as efficient as possible, particularly for smaller companies, was a limit that issuers wanted acknowledged. And then lastly, a confrontational engagement process was definitely something that we could imagine issuers were not necessarily comfortable with. And that came out in our survey as well. So typically, although activist investors, they do generate quite a lot of news flow, we were quite happy to find that in practice, the activist element of engagements was actually fairly small, but still there was a confirmation that it wasn't very highly appreciated by issuers.
That's interesting. And listen, we're all here for the news flow at FS Sustainability. Sometimes it's those activist engagements that let us know that there are things going on that we should cover.
Indeed, for sure.
But we do admit that we have a different, our needs are not always aligned with sort of the goals of investors when it comes to engagements, but we do acknowledge. So based on the report's findings and what you discovered through this process of the research, Sudip, how can investors better approach issuers to ensure that their engagements do lead to action?
In terms of key factors that really increase the likelihood of a company taking action in response to an engagement, we had 5 areas were frequently the most identified. The first one was having a compelling case, so a case for engagement, which was really tailor-made to the company. And that's important because if it's tailor-made, it's more likely to have some kind of benefit for the company itself. So the key element there was that shareholders should be able to effectively communicate that benefit in the customized context of the company itself. The second item was having a quality process. And by process, what issuers meant was really something that was face-to-face and had a direct connection between the issuer and the investors themselves. And typically, when it was felt that there was a quality process, the majority of engagement had actionable outcomes. Another thing which is very interesting now and maybe relates to some of the previous questions, and also relates to the idea of a regulatory push, is the idea of a shareholder consensus. So typically, investee companies did welcome shareholder consensus. So they find collaborative proposals more compelling. And I think we can certainly find that there are certain themes which are quite central to the sustainability space, where collaborative engagements have really gained a lot of traction. So typically, issuers do like that kind of setup, because provided it has direct contact with investors, it really shows them clearly that there's a critical mass of interest in clearly defined and harmonized topics. So shareholder consensus was really one of the key outcomes, where typically investee companies were more inclined to take action as a result. And then the fourth area was strong leadership. So the more knowledgeable the engagement leader, the more likely the company is to act. So that might seem like a fairly straightforward outcome, but in the structure that investors propose resources for an engagement, it was really important to have some leadership and knowledgeable teams to be discussing with companies themselves. And then lastly, a very interesting one was the idea of the cost of inaction. So as well as, let's say the carrot, there was also the stick element, where investee companies were actually interested in understanding, well, what happens if we don't act? So where investors were putting their case for saying that there was a high cost of inaction on some of the themes, and I think we've seen that a lot on the environmental side, inaction was really one of the areas where potentially you could start to see considerations of introducing or improving policies from issuers themselves. And where there was a kind of a case where inaction would be detrimental to customers and even a wider stakeholder perception of the company, that was often a key identified by companies to say that, yes, if we understand better the cost of inaction, we're more likely to act on an engagement.
I find all of this part of the analysis so fascinating, Sudip. I'll often, if I'm talking with asset owners or asset managers, to understand the ways in which particularly collaborative action is a useful tool, and where occasionally a singular engagement by a single asset owner, where that decision comes down strategically, where they feel the greater utility is always such an interesting part of understanding how an engagement flow works.
Yes, for sure.
So alternatively, we've done the do's, Sudip. How about the don'ts? What should investors avoid doing if they're looking to approach a company with a particular engagement on an environmental, social, or corporate governance issue?
So, some of the key factors that would undermine engagement success would include, a lack of demonstrated value. So what an issuer means by a lack of demonstrated value is that where company isn't acting, it's often that they just don't perceive that the costs of the proposed actions actually outweigh the benefit. And, in our survey, 53% of companies actually said that was one of the top reasons that they would not act, is that they just didn't see the value of some of the areas that shareholders were proposing to them. Secondly, also, another area which often undermined success was a lack of relevant knowledge. So this is really understanding the business model and the business case for engagement. And 68% of engagements that didn't lead to action were directly as a result of this perception that there was a lack of relevant knowledge by investors as well. And then another couple of areas, a lack of company resources. So, obviously there's a limitation on how much resource a company can put into some of the changes that investors think are very needed. And that was often identified as an ongoing factor. So particularly having the financial resources and the time, but also sometimes internally the expertise. Because let's not forget that, some of the areas of engagement, particularly around environmental and social factors, do involve quite a lot of new technical expertise and potential operational changes on the company side. And then lastly, one of the key areas as well, which was perceived as a negative on engagement success, was a confrontational process. So as an activist investor, you have a very different position, but typically, that wasn't seen as a constructive position. However, there was a feeling that certain kinds of escalation can erode trust and also reduce the effectiveness of future engagements, particularly when they were public. So that's quite an important area to keep in mind as well, that there was a preference for private engagement, and also when there was an escalation process, to keep it, let's say behind closed doors, in order to really ensure that trust was maximized.
So, Sudip, it sounds like you're clearly passionate about the subject of sustainable investment and ESG. How did you get into this particular role, and what drives you to do this kind of research?
Yes, so I started in the sustainable investment research space about 15 years ago. And my start was actually in the data space. And that's quite important because I think an understanding of the data is as critical now as it's ever been, and it's only going to get more important. So that's really, one of the central bits of thinking that I've always had. But then after, some time with a global data provider specializing on ESG, I worked on the sell side with a large bank, which really allowed me to see some of the differing approaches of investors globally. And I think that's still the case, where we really have quite a wide variety of interests, which are all very valid and important. And then, of course, most recently, in terms of understanding how asset managers work, I think we've seen a lot of evolving definitions of materiality, and certainly that's come a long way. So I do remember, starting off in this space 15 years ago, where a lot of the discussions with issuers on materiality were still focused, on things like charitable donations, philanthropy, or even the number of sheets of paper that were recycled. The idea that environmental, social, and governance factors will have a material impact financially on a company, I think that's something that's still in evolution, but has certainly come a long way since the time I've been in the space.
I'll agree with you there, Sudip. I don't read very many research reports by companies anymore talking about the measure of volunteer days that their employees did as being a key ESG target.
Yes, for sure.
We've been talking with Sudip Hazra. This episode was brought to you by First Sentier Investors. I'm Rachel Allenbachis, and thank you for listening. Thanks for listening to the Greener Way podcast. If you liked today's show, remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Any feedback? Contact us on podcast@fssustainability.com.au. I'm Rachel Allenbachis.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. FS Sustainability operates under an Australian Financial Service License and the exemption made available under the Corporations Act 2001 in respect to any information or advice given. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.
This podcast is not a financial promotion by First Sentier Investors and has been prepared for general information purposes only. It is not intended to be investment or financial advice and does not take into account the specific investment objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. References to specific securities should not be construed as a recommendation to buy or sell such securities. First Sentier Investors communicates and conducts business through different legal entities in different locations. Please refer to the notes sections of the podcast platform you use for more information on First Sentier Investors in your region.